Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
UKIP's new leader, Paul Nuttall, has a big ambition to replace Labour as the main opposition party across the UK. This week, some senior Labour figures suggested UKIP could indeed grab some traditional socialist seats. But that is pretty odd, given that Mr Nuttall can sound more like a Thatcherite than a pinko, and he joins me now.
Hi.
Let me start. Are you serious that you can take out Labour seats in large numbers in the north of England?
Yes, I am, because the Labour Party and its current guys, led by Jeremy Corbyn, seems to be interested in the issues which swirl around the Islington dinner party. I don't believe that they represent working people anymore, and I think we can go into these communities, talk about issues that matter to working people, crime, social mobility, controlling immigration, and we can become the patriotic voice of working people.
And you think that you can do well enough, because UKIP has had a long history of getting lots and lots of votes, accumulating large numbers of people voting, but without getting the MPs.
Yes, I mean, undoubtedly, the electoral system in the past has worked against us. What we've got to do now is target sensibly, drill down in these local communities, and under my leadership, I intend to use council halls and council chambers as the gateway to Westminster, and you'll see a lot more UKIP councillors working hard in their communities, but going into these Labour areas, knocking on doors and ensuring we're talking about the things that matter to those people.
Now, you've said right at the beginning of your leadership that you are a very different kind of leader from Nigel Farage. So what is the difference?
Well, everyone who knows the pair of us within the party knows that we're completely different people. We have different relationships with people. I'm not from any faction within the party. I'm the only...
Clearly you sound different and you look different and all of that, but in terms of your policies and your approach to politics, what's the difference?
Well, in many ways we're similar, OK? I mean, Nigel was my political mentor for many years. I was his deputy for 6 years. But, you know, my real focus is making UKIP that patriotic voice of working people.
So why can you reach these working people in a way that he couldn't?
Well, look, Nigel took us from 0% in the opinion polls to getting 4 million votes at the general election and delivering us Brexit. You know, his legacy is immense. I've got big shoes to fill. I intend to do it. And, you know, my background, I think, plays into the fact that I can go into these Labour communities. I'm a comprehensive schoolboy. You know, I come from a working class family in a working class area in Bootle, and I think we've got fantastic opportunities.
On the other hand, you are a man of the right, not a man of the left, and those are traditionally Labour socialist voters. And when they hear your views about privatising the NHS, for instance, they are going to be horrified.
Well, let me make it perfectly clear. I mean, I stood on a manifesto in 2015, a UKIP manifesto, which I believe was the best manifesto out of any of the political parties, which ensured that we put £3 billion a year into the NHS and kept it public.
That's the policy at the time, but you yourself said, 2011, I would argue that the very existence of the NHS, the very existence of the NHS stifles competition, and as competition creates quality and choice, improvements are restricted. Therefore, I believe as long as the NHS is the sacred cow of British politics, the longer the British people will suffer with a second-rate health service. You want to privatise the NHS.
Firstly, nothing should be a sacred cow in British politics. All things should be up for debate. But, you know, in certain areas like procurement, for example, I think the NHS could do better, because in certain areas the NHS is paying 30% over the odds for certain drugs. If you brought in a private company, you could hire and fire on the results they got for the British people.
You're not talking about procurement there. You're talking about privatising the NHS, which for a lot of Labour voters is anathema.
Under my leadership, UKIP will be committed to keeping the NHS in public hands and free at the point of delivery.
Let me remind you of what you said at the famous hustings in 2011.
What about privatisation?
Well, OK. Again, some people might like it, but some people mightn't. I believe that the NHS is a monolithic hangover from days gone by, and unfortunately we're becoming, or fortunately shall I say, we're becoming an older population, and quite frankly I would like to see more free markets introduced into the health service, because this is the way it has to go. Let's face reality here. This is where it has to go. We're an ageing population.
That's the reality. I'm sorry about the camera work. It wasn't a BBC crew, as you could tell. Nevertheless, it's quite clear you want to privatise the NHS.
Look...
Or you did,
well, hang on,
unless you've changed your views.
Hang on. You know, I made it clear we are an ageing population. We're a growing population as well. At some point in this century, years on, we may well have to have a debate how we fund the NHS in this country. But I want to make it clear, under my leadership, UKIP will be committed to putting more money into the NHS, but onto the front line, into nurses, into doctors, into midwives, because it cannot be right, let me finish, it cannot be right that in England today, 51% of people who work for the NHS are not clinically qualified.
You're sounding like you're now massaging the sacred cow. Have you changed your views?
No, I think that everything in politics should be up for debate. Nothing should be parked, because if you don't debate things, things never improve.
And one day it might go private.
Well, maybe at some point in years to come, within this century, we'll have to have this debate, but it won't be under my leadership in UKIP.
OK, let's talk about welfare. Again, a lot of people are very concerned about cuts to universal credit. Would you reverse the cuts to universal credit?
I probably would not reverse the cuts. I think the welfare budget in this country is...
too high.
I think so, and we need to do something. It cannot be right that we have 1.7 million people in Britain today who are unemployed, 600,000 of them, by the way. Hang on, let me finish. 600,000 of them are between 18 and 24. And this goes back to the key issue of immigration, actually, because last week, the figures came out that we allowed this year a city the size of Newcastle upon Tyne to come to this country. That is insane when you've got 1.7 million people unemployed. What we need to do is to get our own people back into work first before we bring people in to do other jobs.
Your views on immigration won't be a terrible surprise to most people, I suspect. But you've also expressed quite strong views on social policies. You want to bring back hanging for child killers, for instance, and you want to cut the abortion limits.
Well, look, they are...
And in both cases, you want a referendum, is that right?
Hang on. They are my personal views. For example, on the issue of child killers, if there was a referendum tomorrow and that was on the table, I would vote in favour. There's other people in UKIP who would vote differently. That is not going to be UKIP policy. It's a personal view.
Would you like a referendum on that?
UKIP's policy has always been that if, say, 10% of people sign a petition in a small time frame, it would trigger referendums. It works in Switzerland. It can work in this country as well. It's called direct democracy.
All right. You'll have seen the story in the newspapers today.
Yeah.
Do you have a PhD from Liverpool Hope University?
No, and I've never claimed I've got a PhD.
It's on your website.
It's not on my website. It's on a LinkedIn page that wasn't put up by us, and we don't know where it's come from, OK? So I've never claimed that at all.
Did you ever play professional football for Tranmere Rovers?
I played for 5 years for Tranmere Rovers as a schoolboy and a youth team player. I've never claimed that I've been a professional. It was one press release in 2010 put out by a press officer who knows nothing about football. You
have a very over-enthusiastic researcher. Do you still have that enthusiastic researcher?
Well, I don't know where that comment has come from. That was to do with the Daily Mail story today, which said that I had a PhD from Liverpool Hope. I've never claimed... And in fact, actually, if you listen to interviews... It's nothing to do with me. And if you listen to interviews I've given over the past 5 years, I've always spoke about wanting to finish my PhD, which I started in 2004.
Final, very quick question, if I may. Do you think the way things are coming out in the papers at the moment, the Conservatives are going to betray the Brexit vote?
I think we're on a slippery slope. I think what David Davis said last week when he spoke about paying a membership fee indicates that the Conservatives are thinking about keeping us in the single market, the Norway option, which means we won't be able to control our borders. We will have to pay a membership fee. We can't sign our own free trade deals. And indeed, we'll have to comply with EU regulations and directives.
That is not what people voted for.
That is not what people voted for on June the 23rd. They voted for a clean Brexit.
Paul Nuttall, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Now, the far right are parasites feeding on people's concerns. That's according to Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader. He was speaking in Prague yesterday. But is it the rise of the far right that people need to be worried about, or the rise of extremism more generally? Well, I'm joined now by the Labour MP, Luciana Berger. Very good morning to you. Now,
good morning.
Talk personally, first of all, about some of the attacks, some of the abuse you've been getting from the far right.
Well, I'll be going to court on Monday for my third case of someone from the far right who has directed extreme levels of, it's more than abuse, it's anti-Semitism in my direction. I've had one person who's served a jail sentence, one person who's awaiting their sentencing, has been convicted of sending me anti-Semitic death threats, and I've got this case coming up on Monday, and more broadly, generally, have seen firsthand, and know many colleagues that have seen firsthand this increase of in both the noise and volume, and it was shown in an academic report that we saw in the press last week. 50,000 tweets in the wake of our colleague Joe Cox's
Do you
death.
think, I mean, this is, you know, in an age of social media, is it the fact that it's just easier to do this kind of thing and the anonymity in some cases that you're able to gain behind it, or is it symptomatic then of more right-wing feeling adrift to the right amongst sections of the population?
I do think we're seeing a shift to the right, and that's why I think as politicians and within politics we've got a responsibility around the discourse we use to ensure that we don't encourage it. We can also look at the government's own figures that have shown that through their channel process, which is part of their anti-terrorism strategy Prevent, that they've seen an increase in the number of people referred specifically into that from the far right, from around 100 to around 500, of which, you know, we're seeing lots of under 18s as well, particularly included in those figures that are being inspired by the far right, and I think that should cause all of us concern. We should be rooting out extremism wherever it rears its ugly head, and I think it's really important that we don't ignore the very specific issue of the far right that we're seeing in this country and right across Europe as well.
Well, there we are, and your leader making a speech yesterday in the heart, the middle of Europe, when we know about its experiences with the far right, with fascism. I mean, do you accept what he says there, that some of the problems are real, but the solutions people go for are wrong?
Well, indeed, in terms of what the far right offers, I don't believe those are the right solutions, but that's why it's incumbent on all of us to come up with the right answers which address people's very genuine concerns, particularly as we're seeing increased challenges with employment. We're seeing an increase in the difference between people at the top and people at the bottom. The inequality difference is getting greater, and therefore we have to come up with the answers that address those challenges. And it's often the far right that prey on people's insecurities, and why we're seeing, whether it's in France with the rise of Marine Le Pen, or we've got the Austrian elections today for their president, and it's very likely that we might see a far right president elected over there today.
Luciana Verger, very good to see you. Thank you very much
Thank you.
indeed. Now then, the newly elected leader of UKIP, Paul Nuttall, says he can win Labour voters over to his party. It's a threat of particular relevance to MPs in the north of England, perhaps, where a large majority of people voted to leave the EU in the referendum. A lot of Labour MPs there. Of course, I'm joined now by Angela Eagle, a Labour MP for Wallasey, who stood against Jeremy Corbyn in the party's leadership race. And a very good morning to you. How worried are you about UKIP's performance so far and Paul Nuttall's ambitions?
Well, nobody should ever take their own safe seats for granted. I never have taken my seat for granted. I campaign all year round, but I think we have to get this into perspective. Paul Nuttall stood in Bootle as a Conservative in the council elections this century and did very badly. He's a right-wing Conservative. He's on record saying he wants to privatise the NHS and get competition in, which Labour voters are not going to be impressed by. He actually thinks that employment rights are a waste of time, and he said maternity pay was actually mad and counterproductive. Now, what is exactly mad about allowing a woman who's pregnant to go off and have her baby and get back to work afterwards?
So do you think you have to have a bit of a policy examination? You have to get on the front foot as Labour and say to people who voted Brexit, perhaps thinking, well, UKIP had a better message than your Remain campaign in there, that may be tempted to stay with UKIP. You're going to say, well, look at their economic policies, look at their social policies, do a forensic examination of that, and that will hold them.
I mean, Liverpool actually voted 60% to Remain, by the way. I mean, people don't understand that it's a more nuanced, it's a more nuanced thing. But actually, what we've got to do is say, we understand that people are hurting in communities, particularly places where there have been huge cuts due to austerity, where people have seen their job opportunities dwindle, or they're working twice as hard for the same money, or even less. We know there's been a 10% fall in real wages since 2008. So we've got to recognise that. But there are Labour responses to that aren't about right-wing economics and right-wing social policy. And
so you do agree with that? You're going to point those out. You're going to put those front and centre. The other message from UKIP.
Well, there are solutions to the housing shortage. We have to build more affordable houses that people on modest earnings can aspire to live in and go and live in, and then we've got to allow them to have job opportunities and economic opportunities to increase their wages.
It's interesting you touched on housing there, because we've been skirting around the issue and we have to cut to the quick here and talk about immigration. And I talked about perhaps a policy swap here, and a lot of people's analysis of, for instance, pressures on housing are that too much immigration. That puts pressure on social housing in particular, and indeed the overall housing stock. More people equals more demand for accommodation. Do you think Labour can continue with its current policy on immigration,
well, I have to say,
as espoused by the leader?
I have to say, the first thing to say in all of this is that not every problem in our country is created by immigration. UKIP would like to persuade people that it is, and they always go to that politics of grievance and division. Most of our communities, I don't think, want to see us dividing along either race lines or religious lines. They want to see how we can unite as communities and make our society better. That's the Labour way.
But could you defend free movement of peoples within the European Union or within the new arrangement that the UK comes to with the European Union?
We don't know what the new arrangements are going to be, because
would you like to see that?
Well, look, we've got a government that won't tell us what their plan is. That's why it's important that as the Brexit negotiations go on, we have some attempt, and so far Theresa May hasn't done this, to try to bring our country back together. I've never known people so angry. The 52% of people are on one side, the 48% of people who voted to remain think they're not being listened to, and we've got a Prime Minister that sent precisely the wrong signals out of her speech in Birmingham, saying that we were going to go for hard Brexit, which implies an economy that's less wealthy, and it implies fewer jobs and fewer economic opportunities.
Just to nail down that, you know, you've examined the Brexit vote. You know what a lot of that was about. Not all of it, but a lot of it was about migration within the European Union.
Some of it was. Some of it was.
Would you say to voters, because it seems to be Labour is still saying then, we will alleviate the conditions in some areas created by these movements of people. They need more cash, they need more social housing, they need more money put into health and education and libraries and all that infrastructure, or let's control it, because that seems to be the conclusion that many people have come to.
Nobody is against controlled immigration. Very, very few people are in favour of completely open borders everywhere. And in fact, when we're in the EU, what we did say was that there should be a free movement of workers. We were never in the Schengen arrangements, which allow free movement of people. We signed up to free movement of those that have already got jobs, and there's quid pro quo with that. Many Brits work abroad in the European Union, do very well and come back, and there's that exchange in our scientific communities which benefits all of our economies. So we've got to see what we can do to bring about the best possible soft Brexit. Unfortunately, the current government are not telling Parliament what is in their minds. We're finding out with leaks what different bits of the government want to do, and it's getting more vicious by the minute. What Theresa May ought to do is come to Parliament with a plan so we can have a proper debate and try to heal the divisions in our country, make the best of the situation that we find ourselves in, and get the best possible deal for our economic policy and for our future in Europe.
I don't want to keep focusing on the party as the official opposition who were in government only 6 and a bit years ago.
Yeah.
Seem to be nowhere. Look at the Richmond by-election. They're an opportunity to make that very argument. Who made it? The Lib Dems.
Well, look, I mean, it used to be a Lib Dem seat. It was a very unusual...
You're losing your deposit.
6 years ago.
You get fewer votes than you have members.
Well, I mean, clearly the issue there was about who could beat Zac Goldsmith, and most people there obviously wanted to see Zac Goldsmith punished, some because of the disgraceful mayoral campaign he ran that was racist, and others because they couldn't stand the fact that he had been a Leave voter.
So an opportunity for Labour. I mean, you know, that analysis, in the old days, if you had a nice centrist like Tony Blair or Gordon Brown...
I agree that it's painful when you're not involved as a challenger in any by-election, but I think you have to recognise that the Lib Dems held that seat until 6 years ago, and it was Zach Goldsmith that took it off them. They were always in a better position to squeeze
I'm talking about you
the
winning
vote.
it, but you know, that
But
pathetic performance.
well, look, in by-elections, obviously our vote was squeezed because our voters felt that getting rid of Zach Goldsmith was more important than voting Labour in that particular
Labour,
instance.
we were told only 6-7 years ago, the natural party of government.
Politics is dynamic, and if you do not reinvent your appeal to the British people and answer their issues and questions, then you're going to have difficulties. That is what we have to take.
And you would accept you haven't done that?
We are in the middle of doing it. We're in opposition. We've now lost 2 elections, and we have to make certain that we go back to the basic questions which brought us into existence. And we're never needed more now. Look at people who work. They're not earning reasonable wages a lot of the time, and a lot of the benefits of economic activity are going to those who own rather than those who work to create the wealth. That's why the Labour Party came into existence in the first place. We've got to redouble our efforts to say, how do we create a society where those who work and create the wealth can actually benefit from a fair amount of it? That is the policy work that is going on now for the Labour Party. That is how we will ensure that we appeal to more than just our core voters, but to voters up and down the country.
Which brings us to leadership. You know, we've been talking about other leaders. You've been talking about the Prime Minister. We've been talking about Paul Nuttall. I mean, have you revised your opinion of Jeremy Corbyn? You obviously thought he was pretty hopeless when you stood against him. Has he got better?
Look, I think in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, there was a great deal of emotion and anger. The Labour members have given him a mandate, and that is what we will work with. He's just made a speech in Europe saying that we've got to ensure that we redouble our efforts to provide Labour answers to the real problems and issues that are causing the rise of the populist right in Europe. That is what we've got to do. That is our historic role, and he's right to identify it.
I'm fascinated by what you said there about a lot of anger and emotion. Did that cloud your judgment? Are you saying it's that made you stand against Jeremy Corbyn?
No, I think there was an anger and emotion about the Brexit vote in the aftermath of the Brexit vote.
Well, you
and
must have
shock.
been angry. I mean, you were on the other side.
Yes, I resigned because I felt that we hadn't...
And that Jeremy Corbyn didn't do enough during the campaign.
My comments on the record are well known. But I accept the democracy of the party. The party's made a decision. We are now working together to do that policy work to ensure that we can appeal to the electorate up and down the country, not only our core votes, to see off any threat that UKIP are offering in our northern heartlands, but also to make sure that we can take our appeal beyond just Labour out into the country as a whole, because that's the only way you win elections.
Well, what do you say to those senior figures, front bench figures within your party who say, well, look, we've got to bite the bullet. We've got to go for a progressive alliance in seats that Labour can't win, but perhaps the Lib Dems or indeed others, maybe the Greens have a better chance. Don't stand under Labour
the Greens have
candidates.
one.
Support them.
The
Okay,
Greens have
let's stay with the Lib Dems, and we may be seeing, you know, some kind of realignment. And what about in Scotland? You know, you haven't just got the squeeze; you've got a 3-pronged attack on Labour heartlands. What about a progressive alliance, as Clive Lewis is talking about?
Well, I don't agree with the analysis that we have to have a progressive alliance in that way. Partially because it doesn't actually win us an election. If you add up Lib Dem votes with Green votes and you look at where they are in particular constituencies, I think it wins us 4 seats or something. So it doesn't do the job. We have got to remake our appeal to the electorate and voters by talking about the things that they care about most, whether they can have somewhere to live, whether they can have a job that pays, whether they can start a family, whether their children can have better prospects than they have. These are the basic bread and butter issues of politics, and that's what we have to concentrate on, not adding up false bits of votes that are not Tory and somehow thinking that you can cobble together an anti-Tory alliance. The only Green MP in the House of Commons, Caroline Lucas, her main opponent, the only way she will lose her seat is if we have a Labour seat there. That is not the basis from which to have a progressive alliance.
But you know, in our system,
keeps the Tories laughing.
In our system, it's not about the number of seats you have. And look at UKIP and their 1 MP and their 4 million plus vote during the general election. But a lot of those votes cost Labour seats. They let other parties in. Of course, we all know that's the way it works. I mean, you've got to go on a full-scale offensive against that UKIP vote. And what we're seeing at the moment in UKIP voters who say they are switching, majority of them, vast majority, go back to the Conservatives.
Yes, I mean, UKIP are a party of the right. And what we've got to do as a party of the progressive side of government, and this is an issue...
Are you giving up on them? Do you not think you can win them over, UKIP voters?
No, UKIP voters, UKIP are a party of the right. What we've got to say to UKIP voters is those right-wing approaches, privatising the NHS, thinking that employment rights are somehow nice to have but can be abolished because they're mad, to quote Paul Nuttall, that is not in the best interests of working people or their communities up and down our country, and neither is the politics of division and grievance which sets one group of people against another. We can only work together and make progress as a country now if we bring the 48% together with the 52% and chart a way forwards for our country, which is in the best interests of our own economy, but the people who live in our societies up and down the country. You don't do that by setting one bit of the country up against another. And I think it's to the eternal shame of the Conservative Party that they've divided the country. And the Prime Minister has shown no interest so far in leading the country to unite it in the aftermath of the most divisive thing that's happened in post-war politics.
And back to that, I mean, for you going for the 100% then, but you think Jeremy Corbyn...
Well, I like to aspire.
Well, you know, that would be something. That really would. That'd be Chinese then, getting 100%.
Well, no, I mean, I think
of the vote.
opposition is an important process in democracy.
So,
100% is always a bit
But the serious
worrying.
question, I mean, is Jeremy Corbyn the man? Is he at the van of that movement? Does he look like a unifier, like a uniter?
Look, I'm not here to have some kind of commentary on how Jeremy is doing as leader. We've got to do this policy
there
work.
seems to be a bit of an open goal there.
I
The
think-
Lib Dems, it's back to, we're going around in circles, it's back to what the Lib Dems took advantage of in Richmond. OK, you're saying it wasn't Labour territory. We've got another by-election coming up. Labour are nowhere in Sleaford. Talking about the Lib Dems perhaps taking that, UKIP doing well. Labour used to be the party of government, are the official opposition, and you're not making an impact.
Well, it's clear that we have a big task ahead of us, and I think it's a task, if you look across Europe, that other parties of the centre-left have got as well. It's not unique to the UK. In fact, if you look at the opinion poll ratings of the Labour Party, they are a lot higher than the ratings of a lot of our sister parties. But it's clear we have to remake social democracy and democratic socialism for new times. And as I said earlier, the key issue for us is how can we create a society where those who do the work and generate prosperity get a fair share of it. That is the question that brought the Labour Party into existence in the first place, but we have to have 21st century answers to that age-old question.
Angela Eagle, very good to get your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed.
I've been getting away with it all